So good afternoon and welcome to this Chatham House webinar on the impact of the US election on global climate politics. Many of you will have seen President-elect Joe Biden yesterday announce that America is back, ready to lead the world, not retreat from it. And leaders from across the world, including the UK, Canada, Australia, and Fiji, used their first messages to the President-elect to draw attention to the climate crisis. It looks like it will be a central pillar of Biden's foreign policy. Joe Biden has promised to re-enter the Paris Agreement, but of course this will be the easy part. More difficult will be whether and how Biden is able to deliver his climate agenda at home and how effectively he can integrate climate change into foreign policy and national security, whether and how he's able to restore credibility internationally and create any kind of durability in domestic policies. Global climate action has moved forward in the last 4 years without the United States. China announced a 2060 net zero target. Japan has also announced a net zero 2050 target, and the EU remains strong in its commitments and has raised the prospects of a border carbon tax adjustment. How will US climate action encounter a new geopolitical reality? And will the US be willing to work within a new and more competitive landscape? How will Biden's win change the dynamic for COP26 next year? And can climate finally become a common area for global cooperation? We couldn't have asked for a better panel to help us unpack these questions for today. We have here Jake Schmidt, Managing Director of the International Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council, Justin Warland, a Washington, DC based senior correspondent for Time, covering climate change and the intersection of policy, politics, and society, Jacob Worksman, the Principal Advisor to the Directorate General for Climate Action, DG Klima at the European Commission, and Ruana Hayes from the Alliance for Small Island State Support Team lead and Senior Legal Advisor at Climate Analytics. I'm going to ask our panelists a few questions, get a conversation going, and hopefully leave enough time for lots of questions from a very large and diverse audience that's joined us today. I'd like to start with Jake Schmidt. On Monday, not long after President Trump had used his probably last appearance on the world stage at the G20 to rail against the Paris Agreement, President-elect Joe Biden said he would name John Kerry, who previously served as Barack Obama's Secretary of State, as the US climate change envoy. What does this signal about climate change as an issue among Biden's foreign policy priorities? And given the legacy left by Trump, in terms of foreign policy, what are the challenges that Kerry has ahead of him?
Great, thanks, Sam. I'll take that. So hi everyone, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are in the various time zones at this point. I think the appointment of Secretary Kerry says a lot, as does the new position about the priority that the Biden-Harris administration will place on making climate change an organizing principle of American foreign policy. You also notice that all the other parts of the foreign policy that stood up in yesterday's announcement mention climate change, besides the head of DHS, which we'll give him a pass on that. And I think that also says a lot. So it's not just embedded in what Secretary Kerry said, which is obvious, but it also is embedded in what the National Security Advisor said, what the Secretary of State said, what the head of intelligence said. I think as we look to the future, when we were looking at this, we worked with a group of over 60 leading experts to develop a set of recommendations and on what a kind of aggressive, robust American foreign policy priority should be for the next administration. And number one priority for that is always getting the right people and the right structure in place, because people and structure drive a lot of the priorities and how things get implemented. We were talking, to give you a sense, we were talking about creating a deputy national security advisor within the White House. Biden just blew that out of the water by making a principal sitting in the White House and creating a presidential special envoy. So I think that's a huge sort of signal right out of the box. Obviously, I think the last 4 years have been very tough for the world as it's had to carry forward action on climate change with a Trump administration that was trying to derail, climate action at every turn. So thank you, world, for continuing to carry that baton. I think everyone sort of appreciates that leadership over the past couple of years. So the Biden administration will enter, in a very different climate. Sorry, somebody's trying to patch me in. Biden will enter, in a very different climate world, so he needs to recognize that. And I think the challenges are multiple, but I'm going to highlight a couple of the big ones. First, the U.S. has lost some credibility, maybe a lot, in the past 4 years. It can't just say we are back and then everyone will applaud and push it to the front of the train to kind of lead the climate action in the next decade or so. Second, the time is much more urgent and the pace of change will need to be much more rapid. We're talking about pace of change that is very different than we were talking about at the end of the Obama administration. So it means that the U.S. will have to be bolder than it was at the end of the Obama administration. And then the last thing is the relationship with the world's largest emitter, China. Let's just say it has become a lot more complex. And so the dynamics around that have changed dramatically in the last 4 years. And so that'll have to sort of orient pieces. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. There's a lot to pick up there. I'd like to move to Justin Warland and pick up on that point about sort of credibility and how to restore that in foreign policy. I mean, Biden's international credibility will really only be as strong as the domestic policies he uses to back up those promises. And the Democrats will likely be presiding over a divided Congress next year, which of course will limit his ability to pass legislation. So how can a Biden administration incorporate climate change into policy decisions across the administration?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me here and for arranging this really interesting call with this great panel. So I think the first thing I would just say, on the legislative front, is not to discount it too quickly. So of course, it's going to be very difficult with the divided Congress. It's going to be very difficult even if Democrats do somehow manage to take both of those Georgia Senate seats in January. But I do think there's possibility, and I think most people expect the stimulus funding that is likely to pass early in next year to be an avenue for spending on some form of climate-friendly measures. I think it's going to be an early test of the Biden administration to see how much do they prioritize that, how much of that, to what degree is that a deal breaker for them, and how much of their political will do they spend to make sure that the stimulus spending is green. I mean, I think, moving beyond legislation, because I think beyond spending, it's going to be difficult to pass any sort of real comprehensive legislation that might have been discussed, whether it's Green New Deal or carbon price type legislation, at least in the short term. There's sort of it's almost a cliche at this point, but the whole of government approach is going to be key. The Biden administration has installed in its landing teams at all the different agencies, people who are focused on climate. And so they're thinking about decisions around climate, not just, at the Environmental Protection Agency, but also at agencies like the Housing and Urban Development or the Department of Justice. And they're thinking about ways that they can implement climate policy that way. And there's a few, avenues for that. I mean, one is obviously regulation, bringing back some of the regulatory pieces that the Trump administration rolled back. The possibility to promulgate new regulation, some of that, using new legal justifications, given some of the challenges that the courts have put up and might continue to put up. I mean, the other thing I think, though, beyond regulation is just the sort of more day-to-day operations of the agencies and of the administration more broadly. So you think about things like permitting and the way in which the Trump administration has tried, largely outside of the public eye, to slow permitting decisions on clean energy projects where they had relevant authority. or the way in which the Trump administration basically stopped enforcing a lot of the environmental protection rules. And so these are areas where you're going to see a change really just overnight. And I think that's going to make a tremendous difference. And you can just see that already. I mean, you look at the announcement from GM this week, where they had previously fought California's right to regulate their emissions. And they said basically, well, there's a new president, so we're changing our approach. And I think you're going to see a lot of that in this whole of government approach.
We just got a question in the Q&A, which is sort of relevant, which is someone said, what hope is there that 1 or 2 Republican senators will vote for climate legislation? And I guess to add to that, sort of, if there is then the possibility of a sort of more centrist path that could actually be voted on and could pass through Congress, how then does that marry with the splits within the Democratic Party itself, potentially over what a Green New Deal looks like? A Green New Deal, of course, was a very ambitious plan that was spearheaded by advocates for not only environment but also labor and racial justice, and comes in for criticism from the more sort of moderate wing of the Democratic Party. How do you see Biden walking that line?
Yeah, well, on the Republican question, I mean, the central question in some ways is who controls the floor. So if Republicans control the Senate, they'll control what is able to even make it onto the floor to be voted on. And so that's a significant blow. But there is, I think a lot of people sort of rolled their eyes when he said this, but Chris Coons, a senator from Delaware who's been working on carbon pricing, says, well, there are, I believe he said 5 to 7, but somewhere in that range of Republicans who would vote for a carbon pricing bill. I don't know. I'm not as close with Republican members of the Senate. I couldn't tell you whether that number is true, but I do think that I know that there are Republicans who have positions on climate policy that are not the just total denial, and I think there is some room for compromise in some places. It's not going to be a Green New Deal like measure, right? I mean, there's compromise perhaps on things like carbon capture or HFCs. These are things that are, again, below the fold often, but hugely important. I think as far as Biden walking the line, I think a lot of it, frankly, is about messaging. And you've seen Democrats, even on the Hill, try to package a lot of Green New Deal, quote unquote, like programs using new messaging. They did this in the fall with the Thrive agenda, they called it, which incorporated a lot of these sorts of ideas, but called it something different. And I think that's the approach that the Biden administration would have to take to try to get a lot of that through. Whether that'll happen, I don't know. It's early to say.
And another quick follow-up from the chat, and what likelihood that coal state Democrats would vote against it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, right? I mean, I think even if Democrats take the Senate, the middle, the sort of the person that they need to win over is Joe Manchin, who is from West Virginia and a friend of Cole. He famously shot cap and trade legislation with a gun in a campaign ad, back in the day. So I think it's a challenge, right? But at the same time, he is signaled that he's open to certain climate policy. I think also I want to underscore that the environment changes can change very quickly, and I think things are very fluid right now. You talk to some members of the Senate and they'll say, well, if we do a carbon pricing bill, we'll have to find a way to divert that funding to coal communities and that'll get them on board. I don't know. I'm a little skeptical, but I think there's a lot of conversations that need to be had. And I think in a dynamic political environment, who knows where that conversation will be at the end of the Biden administration, or say at the beginning of the next Congress in 2 years.
Thank you. Jacob Worksman, let's talk a bit about first the EU-American relationship. Clearly, Euro-Atlantic relations are something in tatters, in no small part due to Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. How far can Biden go to restoring that relationship on climate change, and where can he start?
Well, thanks, Sam, for the question. And thanks, Chatham House, for the opportunity to join the panel. I have to start by saying that This is obviously a delicate time for transatlantic relationships, primarily because we're in the process of transition. So we haven't made any kind of formal statements other to welcome the results of the election, welcome the president-elect. But we still don't have our counterparts of the new administration in place. And so there's a limit to what I can say looking forward in terms of what that relationship will look like. I don't think it's quite fair to say that transatlantic relationships were in tatters. We still had very strong ties to the U.S. government at multiple levels, including at the federal level, and used the opportunity of the Trump administration to strengthen our relationships even further with state level authorities at the business to business relationship as well as with civil society. And I think that there is every indication that even with a new administration having more progressive policies at the federal level, that those relationships at the subnational level and the contributions that subnational actors will make in the US will continue to be extremely important. What I can say is that I think living political life on a knife edge is uncomfortable for any society to live through, and it makes it uncomfortable for their partners as well. What we will know when the new administration is in place is essentially what the US federal government position will be for the next 4 years. We don't know what it will be thereafter. And that is particularly challenging in a context where you're trying to signal and to design policies at the domestic level, but also internationally, that need clearly to have a longevity well beyond that if they're going to represent a real response to climate change. And so I think that is going to be a challenge for the EU, and it's going to be a challenge for many of the other US's partners of the US in climate politics. I mean, the immediate response to your question is, of course, is that what we expect is that the Biden administration will rejoin the Paris Agreement. That's a pledge that's been made on the campaign trail, and something that he can do within 30 days of taking office. And so that's an obvious first step. With that will come the obligation to update the US's nationally determined contribution, their emissions reduction target under the Paris Agreement. We're told to expect that sometime in the middle of next year, and many eyes will be looking at that to see what level of ambition is contained in it. We're hoping that the level of ambition of that updated NDC will relate to another campaign pledge that Biden made, which is to move the US to net zero emissions by 2050. And increasingly, I think that will be the standard that we use to assess the level of ambition of any Paris party, is have they made that commitment to zeroing out their emissions, and do their nearer term targets, such as their NDCs, in fact align with that pathway?
Thanks. Talking of other countries with big net zero targets and a lot of scrutiny on their NDCs, we should talk also about the relationship between the world's two largest emitters, the US and China, who together account for about 40% of global emissions. A lot has changed since the Obama administration. How far do you think the geopolitics of the relationship permit or prevent a return to cooperation between the US and China? And can Europe play a role there as an interlocutor, as a mediator?
I'm sure there will be. Of course, as you say, the U.S., whatever has changed, their status as the world's largest economy and second largest emitter hasn't changed, and so it's essential that we engage the U.S. and I'm sure China sees that as well. The nature of that engagement, I think, again, will be now. In the context of that knife edge policy and politics that I described before, where we're not really sure how long U.S. policies on climate change will remain stable. But my guess is that we'll see a lot of kind of urgent engagement of trying to kind of shore up as much as possible this signal that the world's major economies, including now the U.S., are indicating that they're taking Paris seriously again. And that we're committing to this net zero pathway that I described before. The EU, of course, will be playing all of those roles that you've described, and interlocutor, as well as a go-between. I think that there's going to be lots of opportunities for co-convening as well. We've seen that the main fora in which the G20 and the G7 countries have been coming together have been really distracted from making any significant efforts on climate change in the past 4 years. And we hope and expect that that will change dramatically.
Thanks. Moving on to that multilateral process and the kind of very critical momentum that will need to be created over the next year in the run-up to COP26, a moment when we are supposed to be ratcheting up global ambition to reach a 1.5 degree target, to also, of course, to see the green recovery and a number of other kind of alignments around critical environmental processes. I'd like to turn to Ruana Haynes and ask, what will success look like at COP26, and what challenges do you think Biden needs to address if he wants to help make that a reality next year?
Thanks, Sam, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, colleagues. And it's really a pleasure to be part of this discussion. What will success look like at COP26? Well, I would imagine, at least from a small island developing state perspective, it would definitely involve very high ambition 2030 NDCs coming in from a very broad cross-section of countries, but in particular, big emitters. We've been in this sort of holding pattern for the past few years where we've been talking about ambition, but we have wildly differing views on what constitutes ambition when we get into the discussion. So we got to COP25, and there was a hope that it would be an ambition COP, or at least an ambition and implementation COP. Countries were clearly not ready at that time to even commit to come forward with new, more ambitious NDCs this year. Now we're in this particular pandemic phase this year without a COP. Many countries are still continuing the work to come forward with those new and more ambitious NDCs. But from our analysis, not enough of the very large or very big emitters, major economies, are actually really committed to that process, at least not for this year. And so I would hope that at least for next year, that would be front and center. We would see those NDCs coming in early next year, or at least before COP26, a number of countries that are in a position to do better and to actually take the lead this year have not done so. They have instead recommunicated their NDCs and said that they will take another look at them before COP26, not giving any sort of definitive time. And that's really an unfortunate situation. Going into the Secretary General's Climate Action Summit last year, it was a similar thing. Where there was a lot of encouragement, a lot of expectation that countries would come forward, and what we saw was a major mobilization by vulnerable countries, small island developing states, least developed countries, coming forward to say, we will continue to take the lead, we will continue to lead from in front, and putting themselves out there in very large ways in the hope that their larger counterparts would follow, and that did not happen. And so this has been happening for some time now. I would also say that at COP25, one lesson that hopefully was learned is that ambition cannot be understood in a vacuum. And so we had what is generally understood as quite a disappointing outcome from COP25. What we understand is that there are a number of different factors at play where issues that countries did not consider to be of a high priority did actually eventually impact our ability to reach agreement on some of the more priority areas. So that being said, I think success at COP26 is also going to depend in large part on what happens in finance rooms, on what happens in adaptation and capacity building rooms, because in those rooms at COP25, the discussions were fraught. The discussions did not reach agreement on a number of issues, and that then impacted other areas. And I would hate to see the same thing happen at COP26. the US made a $3 billion pledge to the GCF under the Obama administration. Only $1 billion has so far been committed to the GCF. There was a replenishment process last year that was somewhat encouraging, with Germany stepping up, the UK stepping up, some others. The US was not a part of that. They're still on the books in the GCF accounting. They're still on the books for owing that $2 billion. So I would hope that as part of President-elect Biden's climate plan, that there would be an effort to make good on the existing GCF pledge and also to go beyond that, because I think that would put us in also a much better position to see real success at COP26. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm pleased that you also talked about finance. I mean, I wanted to just quickly add, sort of beyond the mitigation agenda, and you moved on to sort of the finance agenda, you know, what would an outcome look like that you think would really work for those people who are worst affected by climate change, who of course are also, you know, facing deep impacts from the coronavirus pandemic, and indeed from the economic effects of that and from debt repayments and so on. What are the kinds of outcomes you think that would work for small island states and those most affected?
Well, based on the agenda that we have, specific outcomes are difficult to pin down at this point. I would say that we definitely need to see some progress, or at least a decision made in terms of the discussion on long-term finance and establishing a long-term finance goal to give countries the comfort to know that finance is not suddenly going to disappear or dry up after, well, I guess this year, and we've been unsuccessful in being able to do that. In addition to that, we started a very important discussion on financing for loss and damage at COP25 and in the lead up to COP25. That discussion needs to continue, and we would hope that we can make some progress in that area as climate impacts increase. And as we are now dealing with multiple crises at the same time, which we understand is what the world is likely to continue to look like under any kind of business as usual scenario, it's clear that loss and damage will continue to increase. It's going to ramp up. The issue of finance being available for loss and damage is one that needs to be squarely taken on, and it's one that I don't think is beyond us in order to be able to reach some type of political agreement for. Even in the context of the GCF, there are some hooks now in relation to that discussion. More broadly speaking, adaptation needs to be taken more seriously. We will be moving, I think, further along in this discussion of the operationalization of the adaptation goal for the Paris Agreement at this COP, which I think will emerge as a major priority for many developing countries, both with this COP as well as in the COP to follow. And there needs to be, I guess, some progress made in that regard as well. But coming a bit out of the COP26 context, I have to say that, and I think you mentioned this, Sam, earlier, in terms of looking at President-elect Biden's policy approach, it's not just about a narrow focus on climate change. It's really about that more whole of government approach and that coordinated effort. And I think that applies here as well in the context of looking at COP26. I mean, we are in a context where for the past 4 years, multilateralism on the whole has been in retreat. This is a very dangerous situation across the board, especially when we're dealing with issues of development at that level. So for example, we've been focused on the fact that we haven't had a COP this year, we haven't been able to take decisions, but in the broader UN context, decisions have been taken, or at least an attempt has been made to take decisions, but these have not come to fruition. Every single discussion on development has been fraught, in particular in relation to the issue of climate change. So for example, parties could not agree on an outcome for the high-level political forum that reviews the Sustainable Development Goals. That is ridiculous. This is not something that we should sit by and take as run-of-the-mill, because it's going to have sort of a cross-fertilizing effect when we look at progress in climate negotiations. So I think a part of what the Biden administration should be looking at as well is aligning messaging across different fora, because from where I sit, from the SIDS perspective, what we see is that some of our partners that we have very strong lines of cooperation and communication within the climate context, when it comes to discussion of climate-related issues, sustainable development in the UN context, it's a completely different position. And this is not something that is sustainable, and this is not something that's going to put us in a good position to actually make progress in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. We've got lots of questions coming in through the Q&A, so I'm going to start putting them to our panelists. There's one that I wanted to start with, which maybe I'll put first to Jake Schmitz, but others are willing others, of course, are welcome to come in. How can the Biden administration work with other governments, not just the EU, to enact international climate policies post the Paris Agreement? Do you see certain regions being more open or closed to internationally binding targets?
Thanks. Sorry for the headphone. One of the lessons of 2020, I guess, is not try new headphones and when you're speaking for folks. So hopefully this is better. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think when I think about this, when we look at how to make climate change a top foreign policy priority for America, it it does mean having a broader agenda than was even possible in the Obama administration or the focus. So I think most of the focus in the Obama administration was, rightly around a China, Paris, and India strategy. But the U.S. as it comes back into this, and as I hopefully will stress, is that it has to come back in, with a little bit of humility, but also hopefully some leadership. It will need a broad agenda, and so that means that it does have to figure out how to work with China. It does have to have an early bilateral with India, hopefully sending Vice President Harris to India. But it also needs to have a strategy to work with Mexico, who under AMLO has gone in the wrong direction on climate policy. It has to look at how it can use different tools, maybe working with others to put pressure on Brazil, because Bolsonaro is going in the wrong direction on deforestation. It has to look to its Canadian partners, continue to push Trudeau to be more aggressive on tar sands and boreal forest protection. It needs an Indonesia strategy, et cetera. So I think that one of the pieces that is going to be really critical for the Biden administration is to figure out how to do more things at more high priority level. And that means for us getting good people into some unusual places within the foreign policy operation. So it can't just be the climate wings of the State Department driving agendas, but it has to be also the political bureaus, the embassies, the economic bureaus. So you have a much deeper bench of staff that can be driving this agenda across a variety of countries. So I think the short answer is yes, it needs to be in a lot. And unfortunately, there's a lot more countries that we have to, as the collective world, be driving action on than just a sort of two-party system.
Thanks. Unless anyone wants to jump in there, I'm going to move on to another question which has been upvoted. And I think maybe Justin Warland can start this one, which is, I mean, it says, how much action can Biden take with just executive orders? And I think you started to examine that and unpack that. I thought I'd add to that the question that I still think is sort of overhanging, which is the question of sort of longevity and durability of any decisions that are made through executive orders, and the possibility that the United States is seen as a country that kind of seesaws, between terms as legislation is or rules are introduced and then repealed between parties.
Yeah, well, I would expand the question, if it's okay, just to say executive orders and administrative action, so measures that come out of the agencies at the president's or the administration's direction. Yeah, so I think there's certainly there can be a return to many of the Obama era policies, though as you alluded to, there's a question about durability. There's a question about whether the courts, which are now under increasingly conservative, which are increasingly conservative, might hinder some of those efforts or reverse them or stop them altogether. So so it's a tough picture in that regard. So yes, we could return basically to the Obama era, but at the same time, there's going to be roadblocks. I think there's going to be some experimentation, some novel policy making, trying to use different sections of the law to try to create new regulations. I don't quite know how that'll shape out. I think the final thing, though, there is a lot that can be done just by virtue, as I was alluding to at the end of my initial remarks, by virtue of the president, say, being able to direct federal procurement dollars, right, to say we're going to buy electric vehicles, and that sends a huge market signal for the U.S. federal government to change direction. To make new decisions, or rather to change the direction of decisions on things like permitting, which I alluded to before. I guess, though, just to sort of take the higher level approach, I think you're right to say this is a pretty significant question. There's a lot that the Biden administration can do to spark this discussion, but I think there are big questions about durability, and I think that's just impossible to avoid.
Jake Schmidt, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think those are the absolute right questions. What can he do? How durable is it? I do want to make sure there's a distinction. So folks always confuse this as they say executive orders and executive action. So when Obama moves forward, as Justin says, under the Clean Air Act to regulate power plants, that's under existing law. That's very different than an executive order that has, executive order doesn't have the kind of force of law and the enforcement tools. So, there is a lot that the Biden administration can do, and they've been very, very clear that I think that they will come forward very quick with actions under existing law. So the Clean Air Act of the US is a climate law. It has a lot of authority that can regulate climate pollution. How the Department of Transportation, interacts with the vehicles, there's existing law that they can kind of drive some of those. So it will be, I think the first thing that they're going to be driving right out of the box. There's a clear recognition that they have to clean up their own house. I think the one piece that's different, that's really important to keep in mind is there's a lot more action happening outside of Washington than there was at the end of the Obama administration. So, for example, the Clean Power Plan targets that were set by the Obama administration were very bold at the time, but now all the power sector in the US already meets them. There's about a third of people living in the US that live in power grids that have 100% clean energy targets. That was not anywhere near likely when we were at the end of the Obama administration. And so similarly, I think you're seeing, a lot more happening at the state, city, and the company level, which will continue to move the market and move the emissions trajectory, and hopefully make the policies more durable, because there will be less resistance to them, because that's inevitably what the market is doing and what states are kind of already moving for. But I think that'll be the sort of key question, is how the sort of policies kind of stand the test of time in terms of the the court challenges that will be inevitably coming and so forth. But I think that those two pieces are very different than they were at the end of the Obama administration term.
Thanks, Jake. We have a question from Kritika Singh. Last year, the US delegation did not sign an important Arctic Council declaration until the words climate change were left out. Do you see the Biden administration taking some steps towards climate change cooperation in the Arctic? The Trump administration is auctioning off rights to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge as we speak. It notes that the EU is also an actor in the Arctic. Jacob Worksman, would you like to address this?
Thanks for the question. I'm not sure how directly I can address it, but I do think the Arctic Council provides an example of the many international fora in which climate change is coming up. To Rana's point as well, this isn't just about the Paris Agreement, it's also about US leadership and support for climate action in regional organizations like the Arctic Council, in other multilateral arrangements like the WTO, for example, as well as the bilateral relationships. And one of the ways as we try to search for opportunities to make a Biden legacy last longer than 4 years by advancing progressive policies in international fora, at least that does create a little bit more longevity, perhaps, and durability to a contribution that it can make in the near term. And certainly in the context of an effort to protect as fragile as environment as the Arctic is, could help in that circumstance. People are concerned about the Arctic because of its vulnerability to climate change, but also, as the questioner indicated, the fact that with warming temperatures, that very fragile ecosystem is being opened up more and more to commercial exploitation, including for oil and gas, and slowing that process down under administration could have a longer lasting legacy.
Talking of the other kind of multilateral processes that are happening next year, there's a question about the Biodiversity Conference next year in China, which is currently planned for Kunming in May, and how a Biden-Harris administration will approach it, whether they have specific aims or red lines. Of course, the United States is not a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity, so I'm not sure what line they can take. But I wonder, Jacob, if you can enlighten us on that and what your expectations are for how this interfaces with the UNFCCC and whether the US can take a particular approach.
Yeah, I think, obviously, so the Convention on Biological Diversity meeting, which was supposed to be this year, is a really important milestone to drive, a nature protection agenda, but I think it can also be done in a way that can drive an important climate protection agenda. So there's a large push to get countries to adopt a commitment to protect 30% of the lands and 30% of the oceans as protected areas. And if you do a lot of the overlap on the land in particular, you're going to find that most of that is going to also simultaneously protect biodiversity, protect important special places, but also protect important climate, carbon sinks, carbon sequestration. So I think that's a really important part of the agenda. The U.S. is obviously not a part of the CBD. I think hopefully they'll ask to participate in the Kunming process, or at least sit on the sidelines. The Biden campaign plan does have a commitment to move forward a 30 by 30 agenda domestically in the US. And so I think that's a key part of what they'll be doing, on the domestic agenda. There's bills in Congress to kind of codify some of those pieces. So I think that'll be a core part of their agenda. And so the question will be just around how to internationalize that as a part of their agenda. And I hope and fully expect that they will, bring that forward, whether or not it's formally in the CBD, because they're not technically a party to the CBD, or just by participating in all the other forums where we're going to have to drive that nature and climate protection agenda simultaneous, as Jake said, to the kind of what's going on in the Paris Agreement. So I think it will be at the agenda, hopefully, and they'll drive that through various actions.
Looking at other multilateral negotiations and processes, there's a question about what the new US position on climate might mean for potential negotiations at the WTO, for example, in relation to the Environmental Goods Agreement. Does anyone want to come in on that? Perhaps Ruana or Jacob Worksman?
Well, I mean, I think this is actually part of the Biden administration plans that have been least clear. I haven't, and maybe Jake Schmidt, being based in Washington, has heard more, but I haven't yet heard either with regard to campaign pledges or any planned cabinet level appointments of what the Biden administration is thinking about in terms of doing next at the WTO. Clearly, we're hoping that the overall commitment to multilateralism includes a desire to get the WTO up and fully functioning together, and that means ensuring, for example, that it has a fully functioning appellate body, something that has been slowed by the current administration. There are, I think, many countries, many WTO members see the potential for the WTO to make a more progressive contribution to the climate change challenge, including by the further liberalization of trade in climate-related solutions, whether it's cutting emissions or improving resilience, products and services that do that. And a relaunch of something like the Environmental Goods Agreement could be one way forward in that context, but I haven't heard anything specifically about that. One thing that I wanted to just to add to Jake Schmidt's remarks about Kunming next year, I think that because China is hosting that conference and will be looking to burnish its reputation as a supporter of multilateralism and as a leader on the international stage, I think there will be an interest in the U.S. and other parties to show support, whether they are parties to the CBD or not. So I would expect, messages of the kind that Jake has indicated. The administration has been signaling domestically about wanting to improve biodiversity to lead into messages about the important interaction between the climate change agenda and what are called nature-based solutions. So how do you invest in conserving and enriching biodiversity in a way that also helps nature to fix carbon and to be more resilient to climate change?
Jacob, I might follow up with you on another question that's come in here that I think is relevant about the trade and climate agendas and how they've historically evolved separately, but this is very fast changing, as we're seeing with the carbon border adjustment proposal from the European Union. How do you think Biden will respond both to this specific EU proposal and also more broadly on trade and climate? Is the US likely to use trade policy as a tool to support climate goals? I mean, maybe I'll start with you, but also I'm sure others will have thoughts about to what extent a new administration will likely use trade policy.
Well, that's layered hypotheticals there. In terms of the Commission proposal, we've only made it in the abstract so far. We're still working on what it will look like specifically as a measure. And I'm sure that any new administration's reaction to it will be to that specific measure. But I think that there is no doubt that as countries both commit to becoming net zero and put in place policies that enable them to achieve those goals, increasingly they have to think about the impact of that on trade, on the kinds of products that their consumers are consuming and the carbon footprint of those products, but also the need to ensure that as they cut emissions at home, this isn't driving industry abroad. So the issues of carbon leakage, but also trade-related standards on products and on services, it's going to increase. Those kinds of policies we're going to be seeing more and more. And so we have to have fora in which we can talk about how to design those in a way that are WTO compatible and that are respectful of international rules and international law. And that certainly is the EU's intent in proposing such a measure. On the campaign trail, again, of course, we did hear Biden talk about the need to put in place some kind of measure at the border to ensure that if the US becomes more progressive in its climate measures, it takes this into account. I can't say anything more about what that proposal would look like, but I think that at the very least, there's going to be an interest transatlantically at looking at how these measures are going to be designed as legitimate and credible pieces of domestic policy, but also how our trade flows will be affected if those measures come into place.
Maybe Justin, as our sort of Washington DC watcher here, you could tell us about how likely you think this is to be enacted as under a Biden administration.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we just heard this is something that was discussed on the campaign trail. I think it's very challenging. I think it's especially challenging without a carbon price, which is, and when you think about the fact that the carbon price seems pretty much dead on arrival, at least for the next couple of years, it makes it seems like a big stretch to imagine, any sort of border adjustment. But I do think in the longer term, clearly this is the direction that the conversation is going, and so I will be very curious. This is, I would argue, one of the reasons why I would actually expect that a carbon price is more likely in the U.S. in the medium to long term. But I think in the short term, it's going to be very challenging.
There's a question asked here by Dominic Karatsu, which I might put to you as well, Justin, that says, how does Biden balance energy security with a commitment to climate change? And I imagine it speaks to some of the debates that continue to happen, not only in coal producing states, but also, of course, in places like Pennsylvania, where there's a lot of discussion about the way that You know, fracking apparently reduced reliance on foreign gas, but of course there are different ways to build energy security, and you can do that through manufacturing with renewables. But you know, how does that debate play out, and how important are energy security considerations?
Yeah, it's interesting because you know, energy security has been a term that, you know, we've heard for decades in the U.S. Really, you know, since the beginning of the post-war era, but it hasn't really been in the lexicon of Joe Biden, and it's understandable. I mean, there's an abundance of, you know, energy when we think about traditional sources of energy in the U.S., and I think, you know, the Biden administration didn't, or the Biden campaign didn't really lay out a plan to transition away from oil per se. And I think what their view is essentially, you know, the market will, you know, provide for energy abundance and security, and they're going to put pressures on the market to increase clean energy. But I don't think they're concerned about energy security in the traditional sense.
There's a somewhat related question here actually about the relationship between the Biden administration and the oil and gas industry. A lot of decision making over the production is at the state level. What might be the issues to watch there in terms of legal moves to ban or phase out production or prevent pipeline infrastructure? And if you'd like to start on that as well, Justin, or maybe Jake Schmidt.
Well, I think there'll be, you know, there's certainly questions about permitting decisions, and that'll be a pressure point for activists. You know, personally, I'm not sure that it's the most significant question that the Biden administration will face, but it's certainly going to be a pressure point. I mean, I think you have to look at what's happening at the state level with regulation. I mean, just interesting. I mean, this person lost, but in Texas, the Texas Railroad Commission, which regulates the oil and gas industry there, had a you know, an upstart challenge from a progressive who wanted to use that position to regulate emissions aggressively. She lost, but at the same time, there's increasing pressure at the state level. So I would look to see what's happening there. I don't know. I don't have any specific fights in mind, and maybe Jake has something to add. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, think I think Justin's right. I mean, it's a lot going to be what's happening at the state level, but also in the markets. But I think, you know, Biden will be pushing. Obviously, you know, Trump was sort of open for business, right? I mean, he was basically, there was no portion of America that it was not allowing expedited permits or trying to allow expedited permits, getting away with all the regulations, and we're kind of there. You know, I think Biden will kind of restore a lot of that, you know, by, you know, moving forward with methane rules, you know, which obviously will, you know, be kind of first out, I would suspect, first out of the block, or near first out of the block. He's also made a commitment to, you know, get off of new oil and gas extraction on federal land. So a lot happens on private lands, but a lot also happens on, you know, federally owned lands in the U.S. But I think you're also seeing, you know, which Biden can take advantage of, is a lot is happening, you know, at the local level. So there's almost no, I mean, there's basically no single pipeline now that's not being challenged and hung up in the courts, public opposition. That's also true for almost all the other infrastructure that goes along with oil and gas extraction. But also you're seeing the markets kind of getting out of it. So, you know, Trump's putting out the ANWR for bid, but he may find that there's nobody that actually bids on it, because a bunch of the big financial players have effectively said that they're out, that they don't want to fund in the Arctic. And so I think those two other dynamics will push on and make it easier for Biden to continue to move forward, even though he'll have to sort of balance, I think, the politics of that, because, you know, obviously, you know, who wants to buy? I mean, with oil at the price that it is and the clean energy economy coming out right now, we're seeing projects that looked really viable, you know, a year ago, that just don't pass muster anymore because they just can't pay for themselves. They're bad economics, and they're just a stupid investment. Some people will still invest in them, which is dumb. But you know, the reality is, I think a lot of these will kind of dry up because of just where the trends are going.
Thank you. We're coming up to the hour when we'll have a hard stop, as they say. I'd like to do a quick round of kind of final words from everyone, maybe starting with Ruana. And I thought that the way to frame it might be, you know, since FDR, there's been this sort of focus on the first 100 days as a key benchmark for success in a presidential term. So what would your suggestions be for Biden to prioritize achieving in that critical period in a very critical year? Rwana, would you like to start?
I would say for the first 100 days, what would be good is to hear about this climate finance pledge and whether they plan to honor it and whether they plan to make up for the fact that they did not participate in the replenishment effort last year. I would want to see that done as soon as possible because it hasn't been included really in the clean energy plan that is now out there that contains many other pillars. So that and perhaps some indication of an intended new NDC, understanding that they would not be able to communicate a final one until later in the year.
Thank you. Jacob Worksman, same question.
Well, I think an answer very much along the same lines as Rue. I mean, the easy things that he can do early are the international signals, the signals of re-engagement, particularly around Paris. Would also like to. It would be interesting to see the new special climate envoys travel plans for the first 100 days, reaching out to important partners that have been supporting climate action in the interim.
Thank you. Justin?
I would say the U.S. needs stimulus spending, and it'll be interesting and an important signal to show their commitment via the stimulus spending. To what degree do they really press to make sure that there are green considerations in the stimulus spending? So that would be my thought.
Thank you very much. And Jake Schmidt.
A lot in the first 100 days, but I think he has to direct each of the agencies to come up with specific actions that they can take under existing authority to drive a bold, ambitious climate agenda, direct them to drive climate change as a top foreign policy priority, and signify some early intentions to move forward on cleaning up both its domestic house by starting some processes for EPA and others to regulate, but also, as I think Rue said, send some signals to, in particular, to some of the vulnerable countries that they hear their concerns, and they're going to try to mobilize some things like finance and others to assist some of those countries as best as they can in the first 100 days.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for participating. Thank you to the panelists for being so engaged, and just it's been a really wonderful panel. Thank you for all the questions. Many apologies for not being able to get to all of them. You can stay informed about future environment and society discussion events on the Chatham House website and follow them on Twitter. And thank you very much. And for those in America who celebrate it, happy Thanksgiving. Hope you get a restful few days off. And thank you very much. Goodbye.